I guess, I'll start with how I became a part of the civil rights movement, and then I'll just touch on some highlights. I started because I was born into a civil rights family, and particularly my dad was on the board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so that put my family in SCLC pretty firmly. And his association began many, many years ago when he became a student at Morehouse College in 1931. And since he had been called to preach at age 17, he was a young minister at Morehouse and attending Ebenezer Baptist Church. Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. was the pastor, or affectionately called Daddy King at the time. And on Sundays, during dinner time, the Morehouse dining hall was closed. And so my father taught Sunday school at Ebenezer, and the King family took to him and often would invite him over for dinner at their home after church, which he just loved because, as I said, the dining hall was closed at Morehouse. And so he would eat over there, and then, as was the custom, there would be a night service, and Daddy King and his wife would go back to church, and they would leave my father there to babysit the children. And one of the children was 2-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. And so that is how the association began. And it was just a family kind of thing, and they kept close to each other during the years. So now if we fast forward to the Montgomery Bus Boycott, that would be the time when I met Dr. King, and this would be in the 50s, and I was a little girl, very young, and Dr. King came to preach at our church and was raising money for the boycott. And again, custom dictated that he should be our dinner guest in our home. And so he came to eat at our home, and my sister and I just fell in love with him because he was very playful and he gave us a lot of attention, and he was just kind, and he was talented. He sat down and played the piano. He played a classical piano. I remember him playing a piece by Beethoven that he had totally memorized. His mother was a musician, and she taught him to play the piano. And other memories, early memories, were that he was practically a chain cigarette smoker, and that he had very, very soft hands. I thought his hands were incredibly soft for a man. They felt like velvet. And I wondered if I made that up, but since that time I've read that other people have said that too. I was somewhat in awe of him. It must have been his spirit, because many other preachers had come to our home too. It was just a customary thing. But something about him was special. I couldn't have articulated it at such a young age, but I do remember scooting under the dining room table and hiding from him, and his having to pull me out from under there. As the years went on, of course, he died in 1968 when I was a senior in college, so all of my experiences knowing him were as a young person. But the next encounter was the year of the March on Washington, 1963. And that was the year that our family moved to Los Angeles when my father became pastor of Second Baptist Church. But that was in the fall. And before that time, we were still at Friendship Baptist Church in Harlem, where my father had begun pastoring in 1947. And that was our church. And our church had a community center. We had bought a brownstone well, maybe it was, no, I don't think it was really one of the nice brownstones, but it was a walk-up, I'll say, on the street behind our church. And we designated that as our church's community center, and we did a number of things, community-based programs there. So in 1963, there was a need for a planning office for the March on Washington. And it was decided that it shouldn't be in the South because it might have been bombed or ransacked. And so the office was going to be located in New York, and Bayard Rustin was going to be in charge of pulling it all together. He was chief strategist for SCLC at the time. And so our community center was used on 130th Street, 1 block behind our church. And it is now a National Historic Monument because it was the planning office of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That was the full name of the march. And Bayard Rustin pulled it together in 2 months' time. Well, at that time, I was a teenager, and my first job was working for the March on Washington. And my job was to type envelopes and stuff envelopes and send thousands of envelopes across the country to recruit people to come to the march. And also to go throughout Harlem, leafletting stoops and cars and businesses and whatever to get people to come to the march. So I did that for that summer. And one highlight of the summer for me, and oh, by the way, it was the summer of Martha and the Vandellas heat wave, and it was the summer of Little Stevie Wonder's Fingertips. Everybody say, yeah, And so I was just practically dancing down the street to the office to do my work because, the music was blaring out of the record stores in Harlem. And it was just so exciting for me as a teenager, and it was my first job. I met some opposition. The Muslims were very active in Harlem at the time. And no sooner than I would put a leaflet somewhere, they would snatch it off, and they weren't for integration, and they weren't for some of the aims that we were after at the time, the Nation of Islam. So I had to contend with that. But other than that, it was a pretty exciting summer for me as we recruited people. And our church took 2 busloads to the march. And so I was able to go to the march with my family and experience the excitement and thrill of that day as, many people from various walks of life, all colors, religions, just everybody was there. And it was so peaceful and wonderful. 250,000 people on the mall in Washington. And it was a great experience for me, and one that helped to shape my life and my concerns. One of the highlights of the summer for me was that Dr. King's older daughter, who has now passed away, Yolanda, wanted to go to Coney Island. You may have heard Dr. King speak about how amusement parks were segregated in Georgia where they lived, and how he could not take his daughter to an amusement park. So during the summer, while we were working on the march, he brought Yolanda to New York, and there was to be a day at Coney Island. And that became my job for the day. I was to be with Yolanda at Coney Island and, let her enjoy herself, etc. She was 12 years old. But I didn't know that Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy were going too. So when I showed up at work that day, they were going to go to Coney Island too. And so I was just mortified when I saw that they were both dressed in black suits with ties and white shirts, because that is not how you go to Coney Island or any amusement park. And I knew that that meant that we were going to be stopped all day long for autographs and what have you. And that's exactly what happened when we got there, because people recognized Dr. King. But he didn't let that completely stunt his joy. He and Yolanda rode the infamous Cyclone, which at the time was the world's most ferocious roller coaster, and one that I was afraid to ride myself. But the two of them rode it 6 times. And that was when I was convinced that Dr. King was fearless. And so we went on from there. Our family moved to Los Angeles. And the next time I saw Dr. King was the summer of 1965, which was the summer of the Watts riots. And I had a summer job in the SCLC office that summer. I was a college student by then and was working in the office that summer doing just regular clerical duties. And the SCLC annual convention came up, and all of the ministers, my father and others, because Dr. King had asked my father to open the SCLC office in Los Angeles. So he and the other ministers who were involved with that left the city to go to Atlanta to the SCLC convention. And while they were gone, the riots broke out. And here I was, the only representative of SCLC in the office. Everybody else was gone. And so before I knew it, the news media converged on me for a statement. Well, I was all of 17 and didn't quite know what I was supposed to say, but I remember saying something kind of like what Rodney King said, "Can't we all get along?" and and everybody go home, that kind of thing. But soon thereafter, I got on the phone and I called my father and I said, "You all have to come home right away because I am not the voice of SCLC. And you need to come here and get back here." And so sure enough, they came back, and shortly after, Dr. King came back. And at that time, I had a very unique experience with him. Later on in life, I would become a journalist and a newspaper reporter. And then I would work, before I came into the ministry for 10 years in the newsmaking business. I would work for the University of California in San Francisco as a news and public information officer and write many, 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 many press releases. But this year, 1965, at age 17, I did not know how to write a press release. And Dr. King called and gave me his press statement before he boarded the plane, and I took it down and and ran it off on, some of you are too young, like Doug, to remember this, but we had what was called a mimeograph machine and ran it off and was ready to take it to the airport where he was going to have a press conference when he came in town. And so, as I said, I didn't know anything, Debbie, about how to formulate a press release. And so it was single-spaced, it wasn't double-spaced, and it didn't have more on the bottom of the page, and it didn't have a slug on the top of the page. None of that was present. It was just a typed up single-spaced document. And so I got to the airport, and the ministers were all gathered there, Dr. King, they had a room for us, the press was there, and he began with his statement, and he was reading it. And I guess because I didn't single space it, his eye slipped and he started to read a line twice. And then I felt that all the eyes of the ministers were on me. And afterwards, I was severely criticized for not having typed it up and for having caused the super articulate, oratorical Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to have a slip up in a press conference. And so I felt totally mortified. And as we gathered in his hotel room after that, he came over to me and he said, "No problem, Jini." And he gave me a hug and just let me know, don't worry about it. And so looking back now, if I had been grown, I would have told those ministers, what do I know about a press release? But at any rate, that was an experience where he actually bailed me out himself. And so I was very, very happy about that. The next time that I remember spending any time with him, I was a student at Occidental College, and I believe it was my senior year. In fact, yes, it was in March. It was and that was 1968. It was a couple of months before his assassination. And he came to speak on our campus. And so we were at Thorne Hall in our auditorium, and we were all there to hear him speak. And at that time, we were going to have a symbolic march from the auditorium down to the student quad where the student union was, and he was going to have an informal time with the students, Q&A informal time. And so I sat there in the audience and, not expecting anything in particular, but he actually called me out of the audience and asked me to come and join him with the March to the Quad. And that is when my number went up among my classmates. And they thought, wow, because a lot of them had no idea that I knew him. And I just felt like a big girl on campus that day. And we went down to the quad, and we were joined and asked questions, and he was very, very approachable and loved spending time with the students, and it was a good time. After that, 2 months later, I was sitting in my glee club rehearsing. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Howard Swan, who was the conductor of the Occidental Glee Club for many, many years. And it was just a privilege to be in the Glee Club. But I was in rehearsal when the news came that Dr. King had been shot, and then that he had been killed. And so that was devastating. I called my parents. They were completely shook up, and I went home. It was the last quarter. It was my senior year. And I went home with them so that we could all go to Atlanta for the funeral, for Dr. King's funeral. And then the next day we were going to go to North Carolina because a couple of days after Dr. King was assassinated, my grandmother, my father's mother, passed away. And so we would leave Dr. King's funeral and go to North Carolina for my grandmother's funeral. But while we were in Atlanta, my father was just not with us. He was, I would say he had gone into his man cave, okay? And he just was not in a very, it's like I'd never seen him. And so my mother, my sister and I, and one of my sister's friends from college, she went to Antioch College in Ohio, and she had joined us in Atlanta. We stood in line outside of Ebenezer the night before the funeral so that we, could view the body. And we stood in line with hundreds, maybe thousands of other people. And what I remember about that night was that there is a name for this. It is a celestial phenomenon, but it looks like a halo. And some of you may know what that is, but it circled the top of Ebenezer Church. And it gave us so much peace and comfort. And I just felt that it was some kind of sign from God that one of his precious sons was coming home. And it gave us a sense of, it just was comforting as we stood there in that line to see this halo over Ebenezer Church that night. And so the next day was the massive funeral, and the church members and those of us who knew him were asked not to come in the church and to allow all of the dignitaries to, because it was a small church. Ebenezer wasn't that big. And so we stayed outside in the street, and the service was broadcast over into the street. We heard everything. And after that, we marched, I think it was a 5-mile march from the church to Morehouse, where there was another service and then a burial. And so that was a very sad time for me. Came back to Occidental. I lost interest in my studies and did poorly in 2 of my classes and had to finish up at summer school, but they did let me march with my class. But I completely lost interest with my studies after that episode. It was very difficult for us. And I determined that I would want to work with SCLC after that on the national level. So after graduation in the January of 1969, I joined the national staff and worked with SCLC in the South for 2 years. Primarily with the Citizenship Education Project, which was headed by Dorothy Cotton. And she was the only female member of the executive staff. And I worked under her leadership and under the leadership of Carl Farris. Both of them are deceased now, but he was head of labor relations. And my work took me to the Cherokee Indian Reservation in North Carolina, because I actually lived in North Carolina in my grandmother's house and spent a week every month at our center in Georgia, where we did citizenship education, training grassroots people to go back and get people registered, grassroots leaders, and to have trained them to do literacy classes and all of that sort of thing. So I was 2 years in the South. During that time, I was jailed once in Eastern North Carolina, where the people had gone on strike and asked for SCLC to come in, and I was sent there. And we were trying to have demonstrations. They were being paid very poor wages in their factory. And I was sent there to work with those people. And the city had slapped an ordinance on us saying that we could not march without a parade permit. And a parade consisted of 10 or more people. And so I devised a plan where we would march in small groups and a block or 2 apart to keep the morale up of the people. And we had about 35 marchers. And so there we were marching. No group was as large as 10 people. We were at least a block or 2 apart. But nonetheless, we were all arrested and thrown into the little jail in that town in Beaufort, North Carolina. And so there we were in jail with the relatives of the people who were marching. And we were in a hallway because they didn't have any cells big enough for us. And so we were there, and everybody was shouting back and forth to their relatives who were in jail for other reasons. And we were singing and trying to be like Paul and Silas and keep ourselves encouraged as we were all crowded, about 35 of us, into a small hallway. And the most unusual, amazing thing happened. The older Black women of the community, some of whose children and grandchildren were in jail that night, had been thrown in jail from the march, surrounded the jail, and with aprons on and fingers wagging, they started calling out the names of the police that they had raised and worked in their homes. Now, Mr. So-and-so, my grandchild is in there. She's got asthma and blah, blah, and they just fussed and fussed and fussed. And those jailers let us out. And it was just hilarious to me. We had to come back later on and go to court, but all the charges were thrown out. But it was the women, the older women who were working as domestics in the home of the policemen, who came down there and fussed at those policemen, many of whom they had raised those guys, and they knew them from childhood. And this was a small town, and they told them to let us out of there. And they didn't mean maybe. And they were fussing and wagging their fingers, and we heard them, and it was just hilarious. So anyway, we came through that and had some victories down in that part. And soon after that, I left SCLC. I was there, the national staff from 1969 to 1971. The last thing I did was go to New York, and in 1970, and work with Eli Landau, a Hollywood producer who had set up an office in New York. He was producing the documentary King, Montgomery to Memphis. And it was shown in theaters in March of 1970, one night only, all over the country. And so the SCLC staff was sent all over the country. I went to New York, which was fun for me because that was my native home. And I was promoting the film on college campuses. We were trying to get everybody out to watch it that one night. And so that was my last big assignment with SCLC. And soon after that, I got married. And a year later, I returned from North Carolina to California. And that was my SCLC experience over the years.
And I have a question for you. Okay. What do you think of the current state of the civil rights movement, such as it is? What's your opinion how it is today?
Well, I'm very happy, Andy, to see, and by the way, Brother Talib, I have talked with you, but I never have seen you, so it's nice to see you. I'm very happy to see young people involved. You know, last summer when we had a lot of unrest following the murder of George Floyd, and saw, I think probably for the first time since the days of Dr. King, a truly multiracial, you know, oh my goodness, outpouring of young people in the streets. I was so encouraged by that. I was so encouraged to see. And then all of the books and television programs and forums that followed that online and elsewhere. It's a different approach. We don't have the same central national leaders that we had, although we have some, but it's not like it was back then. And social media has played a large part in things like the Black Lives Matter movement and so forth. And so I'm just very encouraged. I'm encouraged. I've read Dr. Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. I'm reading Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste now. And there've been any number of things that have come out to help us get to the next level. And so I think a lot is going on, and I feel encouraged. I feel encouraged. Mm-hmm.
Doug, one of the things that you didn't say about Jini is she's a great writer. As you can tell by her story, it was in the form of a novel, and we just all went along, and we were all, you know, right there with it. But one of her books is What Makes You So Strong? And that to me, is one of the best preaching books ever written, and it's done with Jeremiah Wright. But Jini, just talk about what you're working on now. Are you working on are you writing anything?
Well, yes, Greg, thank you so much. I very late, 30 years after I got my MDiv, I started studying for my Doctor of Ministry in 2009 at Azusa Pacific Seminary, and then I completed it in 2015. So it took 6 years. But part of the thrill for me was that I was told when I entered that I could spend the time and all the research papers writing chapters for a book. And so I did, and I published a book called From Classism to Community, a challenge for the church, in which I did an in-depth study of classism in the church, in the Black church in particular, but really just as some kind of a model, because it exists in all of the churches. And so that has been something that has weighed heavily upon me, especially with large homeless population, since we have in Los Angeles, and working with that population and seeing how the underclass of our society is generally not welcomed on an equal basis in our churches. And so I wanted to explore that and to talk about our ministry and how we were trying to address that. And so that's my single book. But I do continue to edit books for Judson Press on a contract basis. And I'm editing a book right now that Dr. J. Alfred Smith recommended the author to me. Some of you may know Dr. Alvin Bernstein of the New Bethlehem Baptist Church in Richmond, California. He's written a book where he is examining what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, with the Michael Brown case. And he started writing the book some time ago, but he's comparing that to some of the prophetic utterances in Jeremiah, Amos, Isaiah, and even in the Psalms. So I'm editing his book now, and I continue to edit Christian books and enjoy that.
Jini, I had the great pleasure of knowing your father.
Yes.
And when I first went to USC as campus minister, my first year was his last year officially working at USC, and his office was directly below my office. And so I had the wonderful opportunity of getting to know him. And if the rest of you don't know this, Jini co-authored a book about his life with her father. So, and it's a really good book. So I highly recommend that. But Jini, could you tell us a little bit more about what your dad did?
Oh, okay. All right. Well, his book is called The Servant's Journey, and it's also a Judson Press book. But my father started out in North Carolina, and when he finished Morehouse, he came back to North Carolina, and he worked with the state convention there, which would be the National Baptist Convention at the time. And I was told by a 92-year-old minister the other day, because I was so surprised when, after my father passed away, and we had a funeral in Los Angeles, then we took his body back to his home in North Carolina. And so many ministers came from across the state, and I was just so shocked because he had left North Carolina in 1947. But this minister told me that he established the state convention in North Carolina. And that was something I didn't really realize. So he started out there. He was always a leader and an administrator. And he was always a leader of leaders. And so that was what he did in North Carolina, as well as organize people to vote in Winston-Salem, where he pastored for 11 years. and where many of his parishioners worked in the tobacco factories. And he helped them get better wages and just a lot of things like that before he came to New York. In New York, we were at the Friendship Baptist Church. I was born in New York and lived there until my senior year in high school when my parents moved to California. But in New York, he did a number of things as well in the community and established a group of ministers and worked with an interdenominational group to do important things in the community and racial reconciliation as well. He and Dr. Sandy F. Ray, during the Montgomery boycott, took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to solicit support for the Montgomery boycott, which brought a lot of money. He was always a good fundraiser. I have to say my dad was a wonderful fundraiser. And that helped keep the boycott going, helped with expenses. A lot of people had lost their jobs, that sort of thing, had been fired because of their participation in the boycott. And so he raised thousands and thousands of dollars. That was one of his gifts. That gift also showed up at his beloved alma mater. He was a country boy. He was the son of a sharecropper and a great farmer. We always had all kinds of vegetables and things in our yard because he loved farming till the day he died. He never stopped farming, and I hate that I didn't learn more. I came in on the harvest end, my sister and I. He would bring us in on the harvest end, and then my grandmother would show up to can all the vegetables. But I never paid attention and didn't learn how to can and didn't learn how to plant, but I knew how to harvest. But at any rate, he was the son of a sharecropper. He was a farmer's son. There were 12 in his family, 9 boys and 3 girls. And so they were very useful on the farm. But then his family moved up north. That was in South Carolina where he was born, to North Carolina. And he was supposed to go to Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, but and there was a scholarship for him. But the treasurer of the ministers' union there in Western North Carolina ran off with the money and stole all of my father's scholarship money. So for the next year, he had to work as a butler in a boarding house and save money. And I guess it was just providential. He ended up going to Morehouse. Morehouse, he feels, is the college that made him into the leader that he was. And he rubbed shoulders there with some of the greats. He talks about helping W.E.B. Du Bois with his book, proofreading for him and doing things like that. And this was in the 30s when less than 1% of Black people graduated from college. He graduated in 1935, and less than 5% of any Americans graduated from college. So if you finished college, you were supposed to be a leader and you were supposed to uplift your people. And so that was a message that he and my mother clearly got. They married in 1936. They were married for 61 years. She was an educator. He was a pastor and civil rights leader and community leader. At Morehouse, he became a member of the board of trustees and raised millions of dollars for his college and helped build the Morehouse School of Medicine. He served as chairman of the board of trustees for 17 of those 27 years that he was on the board. And in 1992, the new campus center was built, and it was named for him, the Thomas Kilgore Jr. Campus Center. And so our family is very proud of that. He was not a rich man, but he raised a whole lot of money. And usually these buildings are named for people who are very wealthy, and he wasn't, that's for sure. But he was, in fact, he told me, Jini, I never had more than a $30,000 salary from Second Baptist. And the reason for that was because he wanted all the other staff people to have salaries and to have M&M benefits. So he did not, yay, I have them too. So he did not take a large salary, ever take a large salary at Second Baptist. In Los Angeles, he worked at USC. He spoke for the 1969 commencement, and the president, and he challenged the university, which then thought was in the midst of the Black community, had no programs or any association or relationship with the community. And so it's like a walled off university unto itself. And at that commencement, he challenged USC to help uplift the community around it. And so the president invited him to come and do that. He took him to lunch. And so the deacons and trustees at Second Baptist told my father, okay, you can work part-time there. As long as you do this and that and what have you here, we'll let you do that. So he began working at USC and in the community outreach office that eventually developed some 300 community programs and a number of things to uplift the community. And he also started the USC Black Alumni Association under the model of what had been in his family, that once you achieve something, then you must reach back and help others. Now, he had 11 brothers and sisters. So when he graduated from college, then he had to help educate his brothers and sisters. And some of them had to come and live with him and my mother. And somebody was always living in our house, to tell you the truth. And and just, but he wanted the Black Alumni Association at USC to have that kind of mindset. We will help African-American students who come behind us. And they have done that. I am so proud of them. And he set a goal for them to reach a $1 million endowment scholarship fund. And a few years ago, they reached that goal. So there were other things that happened. He became a county commissioner under Tom Bradley, and their signature work was the Baldwin Hills Crenshaw Mall. And just many other things that he did during his lifetime before he passed away at age 84, just a few days ahead of his 85th birthday in 1998.
This is Pastor Baylard, First Community Baptist Church. Awesome history, awesome testimony. I am a lifetime member of Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so I am thrilled to hear the things that you're sharing with us. And I do know Dr. Bernstein, he's a good man of God with the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated. Quick question. What would you like to see today in regards to the changes in our relationship as the people in these United States?
Well, first of all, I care about survival. I'm a mother and a grandmother and a great-grandmother. I care about survival. I have a son. I have 3 grandsons, young men in their 20s, and I'm very concerned about them. I want our society to be safe. And I feel tears coming into my eyes because I want our society to be safe for our young men of color. And I do not want them to be perceived of as threats. And so that's number 1 on my list, and many, many changes to our criminal justice system I would like to see happen. More justice for sure. Then secondly, I'd like to see African Americans shore up the family. And I would like to see more family. I'd like to see more marriage and more family with our young people, because I truly believe the family is the backbone of any society. And so I would love to see more people getting married and having children and becoming established. But I know that that also means jobs and preparation. And so thirdly, I would like to see us validate everyone. And when I say that, I mean that I taught as an adjunct person, sometimes to supplement my ministerial income. I taught for about 18 years in community colleges and state universities in the 3 states that I lived, Texas, Tennessee, and California the last time. And I taught freshman English and other composition and writing courses. And about a third of the freshman class always dropped out after about sometimes the first year. These were young people who were not suited for a 4-year college education, either by preparation or desire. But many of them found themselves in the trades. They found themselves in medical professions, hygienists, dental hygienists, different kinds of medical technicians, phlebotomists. They found things that they could do, but they were not suited for the 4-year college education. But what they had to overcome was people looking down on them for that. You know, in other words, if you didn't finish a 4-year college, you weren't quite up to stuff. So I would like to see, I think COVID has taught us who's essential. Is your name on that list? I'm not on the essential workers list. You know, who's essential these days? Some of the people that we said weren't essential, you know, what would we do without our grocery store clerks and our people who pick up our trash and people who help us to live day by day? So I would like to see us validate young people and give them a living wage so that they can build a family. I would like to see the housing market come down so that people can buy homes and just have a life. And so these are some of the things that I think about. Yes.